Hello, fourth grade. Welcome back to your math lessons. At this point in time, you should have finished Chapter 18 review and taken Chapter 18 test. We're going to be starting a new chapter today, Chapter 19. In this chapter, we are going to learn how to add decimals. Before we do that, though, we're going to do a quick review on rounding. Today's lesson is Lesson 19.1, Round Decimals, from page 492. If you don't already have your math journal out and your textbook, please pause the video and restart when you have your journal labeled and your textbook open. It's been a while since we have done rounding, so let's do a quick review. To round a number means to see if it's closer to one thing or another. Rounding helps us be able to make calculations much more quickly. I have a number line here with a decimal, 8.2 or 8 2/10. When it's placed on the number line, we can see whether it is closer to the whole number 8 or the whole number 9. Taking a look, I see that 8.2 is much closer to the whole number 8 than it is to the whole number 9. When rounding, we would round 8.2 to 8. We would round it down because it's closer to 8 on the number line. However, sometimes you don't always have a number line handy to be able to draw out, and it takes a lot of work. So I'm going to remind you about our rounding rules so that you know how to do it without using a number line. So these are our same rounding rules that we used for rounding at the very beginning of the year when we were just learning how to round regular whole numbers. The rules do not change for decimals. It stays the same. However, it feels a little bit odd to round decimal numbers because of the decimal point. So we'll get into that in our lesson today. At this point in time, I'd like you to pause the video, and I would like you to please copy these rounding notes down in your journal. When you're ready, start the video. All right, so you should have paused the video to copy these steps to rounding down in your journal so that you have them handy. When we began learning how to round, we came up with a rhyme together. 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, let it soar. This rhyme is going to be very helpful to remind you whether you should round a digit up or down, and will be a helpful mind trick for you while you are solving your math problems. Let's go over the steps to rounding a number. These steps are exactly the same whether it's a whole number or a decimal. Step 1, we need to find the place value that we are being asked to round to. We underline it. Then, step 2, we look to the right of the digit. And step 3, if the digit to the right is 4 or less, our rounding digit stays the same, or it rests. If the digit to the right is 5 or more, we add 1 more, and the rounding digit soars up by 1. Step 4, all of the digits in front of the rounding digit stay exactly the same. So this is really important when we're talking about decimals. No matter where that decimal point is, whatever digits came before the rounding place, those all stay the same. All of the digits behind the rounding digit turn into zeros. Now the one tricky thing will be making sure that you have the decimal point still where it needs to be. We'll get into that while we practice. Okay, so this is number 1 from your textbook. We're going to just do a little rounding warm-up, okay, seeing how much we remember about rounding. So I have these numbers here, 14.9, 15.5, 15.23, and 14.49. Let's write them all down together, and then we'll solve number 1. All right, number 1 asks, in which numbers is the digit in the tenths place 5 or more? Which numbers will round to 15 when rounded to the nearest whole number? So first things first is we need to make sure we understand where the tenths place is. The tenths place is the first place behind the decimal. So go ahead and underline the tenths place in each of those numbers we just wrote down. All right, so the first question is, in which of these digits is the tenths place 5 or more? Let's go ahead and circle those numbers. 9 is 5 or more. 5 is 5 or more. And nothing else. Let's go ahead and stop there for a moment. Second question is, which numbers will round to 15 when rounded to the nearest whole number? So for that, we are rounding to the nearest whole number. So what that means is our rounding digit is going to be the ones place. So if you hear today in your directions or in our lesson together here, you need to be looking at the whole number. When you hear that, that means the ones place, because that is the first number that is not a part. So I'm going to go ahead and very carefully, I'm going to erase my previous underlining of the rounding digit. Let's see, actually I can just move it. Okay, that works out better. Go ahead and erase the tenths place, and let's just underline the ones place in each of our numbers. We're doing that as the rounding digit because it has asked us which ones will round to 15 when rounded to the nearest whole number. Okay, so let's take a look at 14.9 first. We underline our rounding digit and we look to the right. If it's 5 or more, our rounding digit soars. If it's 4 or less, our rounding digit rests. 14.9, when we round it to the nearest whole number, will equal 15. We copy everything before the rounding digit, which would be the 1. Our 4 changes to a 5 because it's soaring up, and everything else behind the rounding digit turns into a 0. Now this is the part that is different for us with decimals. That 9 is going to turn into a 0. However, I need to keep my decimal point right where it was before so I don't change the overall value. So make sure you add that decimal point back in. Let's take a look at 15.5 now. Underline the whole number. Look to the right of the rounding digit. If it is 5 or more, our rounding digit soars. 4 or less, it will rest. I copy everything before the rounding digit, which is just a 1. My rounding digit this time is going to soar again because of that 5 to the right of it. So my rounding digit becomes a 6. I keep the decimal point where it is and everything else turns into a 0. Now 16.0 is the same thing as saying 16. Remember, anything that is zeros added to the end of a decimal point, they don't actually have value as long as they're the final digits in the number. So in this instance, 14.9 rounded to 15. So we can go ahead and circle that one. But 15.5 did not round to 15. It rounded up to 16. So that one doesn't work. Let's take a look at our next one, 15.23. We've underlined our rounding digit, which is the whole number 1, the ones place. Look to the right. Our rounding digit is going to rest because the number to the right is a 2, which is 4 or less. Copy everything before the rounding digit. The rounding digit stays the same. Everything behind it turns into a 0. Keep that decimal point where it originally was. Turn the 2 into a 0 and the 3 into a 0. 15.23 also rounded up, so we can go ahead and circle 15.23. That also rounded to 15 total. Okay, 14.9, last one for number 1. We're going to underline our rounding digit, which is the ones place. We're going to look to the right of the rounding digit. If that number is 5 or more, our rounding digit soars. If it's 4 or less, our rounding digit rests. In this case, it's 4 or less, so we copy everything before the rounding digit. Oop, I'm at that curvy part of the notebook page. Sorry, friends. Our 4 stays a 4, and everything behind it turns into a 0. Keep the decimal point where it is. turn everything else into a 0. So 14 and 49 hundredths, when rounded to the nearest whole number, rounds to 14. That's not what we're looking for, though, so this one we can cross off. So the only two numbers that rounded to 15 was 15 and 23 thirds, 23 hundredths, and 14 and 9 tenths. All right, so for these next 2 through 6, we're going to round each number to the nearest tenth and each money amount to the nearest dollar. So when we're dealing with money, don't let the dollar sign fool you. The dollar sign is just a symbol, so just treat the number as usual like a decimal. However, when we're rounding to the nearest dollar, that is like saying the same thing as rounding to the nearest whole number. So we're going to underline the ones place for dollar amounts for these instructions. And for the ones that are just decimals, they've asked us to round to the nearest tenth. So that's going to be the number that is right behind the decimal point. Number 2 is our first problem. We're going to write 45 and 67 thousandths. Hundredths, I'm so sorry, hundredths. Please underline the tenths place. We're going to round this number to the tenths place. We're going to look to the right of the rounding digit. If it's 5 or more, our rounding digit soars. If it's 4 or less, our rounding digit rests. So we're going to copy everything before the rounding digit, especially the decimal point. Our 6, is it going to soar up to a 7 or stay the same as a 6? It's going to soar because the 7 next to it is greater than 5. So our 6 becomes a 7, and everything behind the rounding digit turns into a 0. Let's try number 3. 8 and 23 hundredths. We're going to round to the nearest tenth. Please underline the tenths place. Look to the right of our rounding digit. We need to start thinking, is our rounding digit going to soar or rest? Let's copy everything before the rounding digit, especially the decimal point. Our rounding digit is going to rest because 3 is less than 4. We're going to keep the 2 as a 2. Everything else behind it turns into a 0. Our number rounds to 8 and 2 tenths or 20 hundredths. I also just realized, my friends, I have been using the wrong symbol for rounding. Oops, that was way too big. I've been using the wrong symbol for rounding. Does anyone remember what the symbol is supposed to be when we're rounding? It's supposed to be that squiggly equal sign because we're showing something that is about how much or about how many. So make sure, go back and go ahead and change those to the equal sign that's squiggly to show about how much or about how many. All right, let's take a look at number 4. This will be our first one with a dollar amount. Make sure you copy down the dollar sign and the decimal point. We have $19.35. Now, our directions asked us to round each dollar amount to the nearest dollar. So that means the nearest whole number. I'm going to underline the ones place because that will be the nearest whole. Just like before, my rules do not change. I look to the right of the rounding digit. If that number is 4 or less, our rounding digit rests. If it's 5 or more, our rounding digit soars. I copy everything before the digit, which would be the dollar sign and the number 1. Our rounding digit is a 9. I look to the right. I see that the number to the right is a 3, so our rounding digit is going to rest. So it's going to stay a 9. I'm copying the decimal point. Everything else turns into a 0. Now, let's pretend that this was something different. Let's pretend that this is something different. I'm going to just add this as an extra one. So just go ahead and put a star. let's pretend that this was actually $19.75. When I'm rounding to the nearest whole number, I'm going to still be looking to the right. Now this time, do you see how the rounding digit is 5 or more? That's going, or the number to the right is 5 or more. That's going to make our rounding digit soar, but I'm at a 9. So if I soar up by 1, that's going to be 10. I want you to think back to when we first did this unit on rounding. What do I do when I need to make my rounding digit from a 9 to a 10? What we need to do is we need to treat this like regrouping, as if we were adding. The 9 is going to become a 0, and I'm going to add one more on to the next digit, which would make this 1 plus 1 over here, which is going to equal 2. So instead of copying the 1, that 1 is actually going to change into a 2 because it's helping my rounding digit soar. Okay, so the 1 becomes a 2. Everything else will turn into a 0. Keep that decimal point. Keep the dollar sign at the beginning. We'll solve a couple more like that so you're comfortable. This is only a special case when our rounding digit is a 9 and it's soaring. We have to treat it like regrouping when we're adding. Okay, let's go ahead and solve. We're going to skip 5. Let's solve number 6. Number 6 says $48.92. We're going to round this to the nearest whole number, which would be the nearest dollar amount, which would be the ones place. Look to the right. Is our rounding digit going to soar or rest? It's going to soar because 9 is 5 or more. Go ahead and copy down everything before the rounding digit, which is a dollar sign and a 4. Our 8 becomes a 9. We copy down that decimal point. Everything else turns into a 0. $48.92 is about $49. All right, I'm going to have you go ahead and solve a couple on your own and pause the video, and then I will reveal the answers. So I would like you to solve number 8, number 13, and number 14. Go ahead and pause the video, unpause when you're ready, and I'll reveal the answers. Okay, so you should have solved these by now. Number 8, 4 and 56 hundredths. We're rounding to the nearest tenth. That should round to about 4 and 60 hundredths. Number 13, $3.57 should round to about, rounding to the nearest dollar, should round to be about $4. And number 14, this one was tricky because it has that 9 as the rounding digit. So $9.98 should round to about $10. Now I am going to model number 14 out for you because it is probably the trickiest one. So if you didn't get that right, go ahead and work again with me. If you did get it right, congratulations, sit back for just a moment. So $9.98, my whole number, oh, this is a little bit too far down. Let me bring this up so I can write on my screen. So the whole number 9, I need to round to because I'm rounding to the nearest dollar amount. I look to the digit to the right. Ooh, that's big. It's 9. That means I'm going to definitely soar up by 1. However, if I sort up by 1, that makes it a 10. So I need to turn the 9 into a 0 and add a 1 on regrouping. There's nothing to add that 1 onto, so it just becomes, it just gets brought down. 1 plus nothing is just 1. I copy my 0, everything else turns into zeros. Okay, you all are working very well, I'm sure. Let's take a look at a few more. A few more practicing rounding to the nearest whole number. Let's take a look at number 18. 6 78 hundredths. So the directions say to round to the nearest whole number. That means that we're rounding to the ones place because we want it to be a whole number. We don't want any parts. Look to the right of the rounding digit. Is it going to soar or rest? It should soar because the digit to the right is more than 5. 6 becomes a 7, everything else turns into a 0. Now, 7 and 0 hundredths is also the same thing as just saying the number 7. So if you get two zeros behind the decimal point, you can simplify that by just writing the whole number, especially since the directions say to write to the nearest whole number. I'd like you to convert that just to the whole number when that comes up. Let's take a look at number 19. 5 and 24 hundredths. We're going to round to the nearest whole number. Underline the ones place because that will be the nearest whole number. Look to the right. Does our rounding digit soar or rest because of that 2? It should rest because 2 is small. It is less than, it's 4 or less, so our rounding digit rests. The 5 stays the same. Copy the decimal point. Everything else turns into a 0. Because I have 2 zeros here, I need to change this into just the whole number, which is 5. All right, we're going to do one more, number 22. I'd like you to pause the video, solve this one on your own, unpause when you're ready, and I will reveal the answer. All right, 57 and 98 hundredths, round it to the nearest whole number, should be just the number 58 is what you should have ended with total. Our rounding digit is the 7 in the ones place. We look to the right, copy everything before. The rounding digit soars. Everything else turns into a 0. Then we need to make sure that we knock that decimal point and the extra zeros off to make it just the whole number 58. All right, class, so today you're going to be completing 19.1 PW. You're going to do all of the work page. I want you to please be sure to read the directions to see what place to round to. Please remember, if it's a dollar amount, you're going to most often be asked to round to the nearest dollar. That just means, or the nearest whole number. That just means you're rounding to the ones place. Okay, so be sure to read the directions today. I will see you back tomorrow for lesson 19.2.